was actually on May 1st, or was it on May 3rd? You don't know, I suppose.
No, I do not offhand. The setup to Vietnam and meeting, Howard, your background as well. You were a Marine, right?
Yeah.
During World War II?
No, I was 14 when the war ended. See,
Could you just start by saying your name?
Yeah, Daniel. When you get ready.
I'm just going to ask you one more thing. I'm trying to get your eye line a little bit more this way, which I know is awkward. Okay. But maybe, Dennis, you could pull over even a little bit more.
How old is Howard exactly?
78.
And when is his birthday, do you know?
Oh, I don't know.
That may make it easier for you.
Born in 1922.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
22.
Right.
You don't know the month?
No.
Now, I'm born in 31. I'm 68. I don't know how that fits. It sounds as though he's 11 years older, but it must be, birthdays must fall in such a way that he's about 10 years older. 22. I'm born in April 31.
So were you in Korea? Or?
No, so I was in during the Korean emergency in 54 to 57. Okay. I got in right at the end of the Korean emergency. And then I was in Vietnam as a civilian, but I was in combat.
Okay. One of the questions that I'm intrigued with, and at least, how did you go? You were part of the administration at first.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how did you go from policy making, or assisting in policy making, in the administration, in the Johnson administration and Kennedy, right? To the Pentagon Papers and releasing them? That's a huge jump.
When do we start? You haven't started.
I'm rolling.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Did you want to ask the question then, or
no? Could you just say your name then?
Okay, I'm Dan Ellsberg.
Okay.
And
just as for like recording, I know who you are.
Yeah. So Howard is just 10 or 11 years older than I am, like my half-brother who was in the Air Force, like Howard, in the Second World War. I was 14 when the war ended. I enlisted in the Marines in 1954, which was the very end of the Korean emergency. So I didn't get to Korea, although I was in an operation in the Marines during Suez in 1956. I extended in the Marines to be in on that. Then I was a civilian working in the Pentagon on Vietnam in 64, 65. And partly because of my Marine background, I volunteered to go to Vietnam to see for myself what that war involved, and to see it up close, which I ended up doing. I saw the war very close. I used my Marine training to work with troops, although I was a civilian. And in the end, in 67, I was in a fair amount of combat in provinces south of Saigon in particular, in guerrilla war, and saw the nature of guerrilla war up very, very close. You ask how I changed from a decade of working for the government in the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department, and then the State Department. I had volunteered to transfer to the State Department to go to Vietnam. And the answer is, first of all, just being in Vietnam. I was one of millions of Americans who went there and realized that the war would not be won, that our objectives would not be achieved there, no matter how long we fought, and that people were being killed and were dying uselessly and hopelessly for nothing, really, in a strongly stalemated war. So I came back determined to try to end the war, and at first from within, using my access and my position, I went back to the Rand Corporation and worked on a study of the war, which was a second factor in my education, because that took me back historically to the early days of the war, when what we called the French War, but which was really a French-American war against Vietnam, essentially a colonial war. I'd known very little about that when I was in the Pentagon or in Vietnam, and I think none of my colleagues knew anything about it at all. So our sense of history, which for an American usually began the day he got into the problem in some way, had been very, very weak. And my relation to the war undoubtedly would have been different, as would our country's, if we had had more sense of the history of that involvement. But the question really was what to do about it once you knew that it was a wrongful war from the history and a hopeless war from being there. Most Americans who'd been involved at all came at least to that second conclusion, that it was a stalemated war that was hopeless. But the question, as I say, was what to do about it. There, the crucial thing was that I came to meet people who were followers of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, and who were involved in nonviolent civil disobedience or draft resistance against the war. In 1969, I was at a meeting of the War Resisters International Conference, War Resisters League, in Haverford, Pennsylvania. And that's an organization of post-World War I conscientious objectives who had been involved since then in direct action against colonial wars, against oppression, against war in general, and against the nuclear arms race. So I met people who were on their way to prison for draft resistance as the strongest action they could take in their lives, nonviolently, truthfully, to express their opposition to the war. And when I realized that that was the best thing they could do with their lives and that they were able to do it, it put the question in my mind, what could I do to help end the war if I were ready to go to jail, now that I was ready to go to jail? Because as I met these people, I realized that I could do and should do what they were doing. And that suggested to me possibilities that I just wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Most people don't confront the challenge to go to jail, but they often confront a challenge to do the right thing or to say the truth at the risk of their jobs. And they usually don't choose, I would say, to risk their careers very much, partly because they don't have examples of that. They don't. Courage of that sort is contagious, and they may or may not have the luck to meet somebody who was exhibiting that kind of courage, and I had that luck. So when I met Randy Keeler, who was, after he'd been in prison, the national coordinator of the freeze campaign, the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, when I saw that he was on his way to jail, it inspired me to do something similar. And that made me think of the fact that I had in my safe at the Rand Corporation, my own top secret safe, 7,000 pages of documentary history, actually, and documents of lies and broken treaties and aggression by the United States. And I knew that history was continuing. My real objective was not just to set the record straight or to enlighten people about the past. I was trying to change the present and the future. I knew that Nixon was continuing in the same pattern of 4 of his predecessors in Vietnam. Without the public knowing it, he was making the same lies and the same concealment and the same threats of escalation that were going to enlarge the war. So I hoped that it would help to avert that if people understood that he was actually doing just what his predecessors had done. And for that, they had to have this history. Since it was top secret, I took for granted that I would go to jail for the rest of my life by putting this out. That's what I expected. And in the end, I was indicted, facing 12 felony charges for a possible sentence of 115 years. That wasn't all that was done against me, because Nixon understood correctly that I was trying to change his policy, not just to tell history about his predecessors. And he knew that he couldn't stop me just by threatening me with jail. He'd already done that, and it hadn't stopped me. So he sent people to shut my mouth, really, to silence me from putting out more information about him by other means, by blackmail, or even by assaulting me or killing me, perhaps. In 1972, a dozen people were brought up from Miami to incapacitate me totally, as I was giving a speech, actually, on the steps of the Pentagon, or the Capitol. Those same people were caught weeks later in the Watergate, and thus they were in the hands of prosecutors with knowledge that the president had earlier sent them on criminal actions against me. So the president had to keep them quiet by bribing them. And that was obstruction of justice. Those were new crimes of cover-up. And those had to be covered up in turn. In the end, while I was on trial, John Dean gave that information to the prosecutors in an attempt to get himself a lighter sentence for his crimes of cover-up. And when that came out in my trial, it did lead to the dismissal of my charges. Howard Zinn had just recently testified for me in that trial, actually, on history. But the charges were dismissed, but more importantly, that really started the process whereby Nixon was forced to resign. It was the crimes against me and other members of the anti-war movement that made Nixon himself vulnerable to impeachment and conviction. The other crimes for which Watergate is more well known, like breaking into the Watergate, the dirty tricks, the campaign contributions, were never traced to Nixon personally, even to this day. So he wasn't really vulnerable on those. What made him vulnerable was the orders he'd given in the Oval Office to neutralize, quote, neutralize me, and take other actions against the anti-war movement. So the people who inspired me to act, and the others who acted at the same time, and I, all provoked a kind of reaction from Nixon that brought him down and made the war endable. They were more powerful, these actions, than they seemed at the time, or than we could have foreseen entirely. And they did prove to be useful. So I remain very grateful to all the people in that tradition. And of course, Howard Zinn is very much in that tradition. That's how I met him, in fact, going back to early 1971. I was in actions with him directly. We were faced arrest together on occasions even before the Pentagon Papers came out. And he had been doing that for a long time and chronicling it and trying to explain to people the power of this kind of action. In fact, that's one of the things that I've heard him testify on in my trial and other trials, the history and the power of the tradition of civil disobedience, nonviolent civil disobedience in the United States. He lives that in his own life. He writes about it. He's a marvelous educator. And this is the sort of thing that is best taught by someone who has exposed himself or herself to the risks themselves. It's very hard to communicate to people convincingly that they ought to consider taking risks with their own careers and their own freedom, unless you are understood to be someone who has faced that choice yourself.
Do you think as citizens? Do you think as citizens in a democracy we have a responsibility to, in regards of things of war and peace, to take those risks?
Yeah. Well, certainly. What I came to realize from seeing the example of Randy Keeler and Bob Eaton and others who went to prison, David Harris, is that citizens should recognize that there are occasions, especially involving war and peace, where they should be willing to take the kinds of risks in their own lives that we routinely expect of young men that we send off to war. We expect them to risk their lives for their teammates or for the country or for a cause. But it doesn't occur to people that it's just as challenging and obligatory in some cases to take risks with your career against the policies of a president who's gone wrong, and to set the country straight, basically. Once I think people recognize that there's a similarity in those situations, I think they could very well rise to the challenge. But they rarely make the connections. It's taken to be the very definition of patriotism that you'll risk your life unquestioningly in the service of the commander-in-chief. But when the commander-in-chief has abused his powers or is going in a wrong direction, which is very common in this country and others, it just doesn't rise to people's minds that it might be their duty as citizens, especially in a democracy, to sacrifice their own futures, if necessary, to save the lives of a lot of people. If they face that, and as Howard has shown in so many parts of his history, telling the truth, a truth that the president doesn't want told, can be very powerful. You have the chance, if you know a truth that politicians are trying to conceal, you have the chance, just by telling it effectively, to save a great many lives, and that's a power that you don't have every day.
When you were working, what were the obstacles you ran against when you were trying to change things from within?
Well, from within, there is actually more leeway than people realize to speak your mind and to criticize an internal policy within channels than people realize. So long as you commit yourself not to wash dirty linen in public, not to reveal the same facts to another part of the government, to another agency, to Congress, or to the press, if you can be relied on to lie and to conceal the truth to outsiders outside your particular agency or the government, your own dissent inside can be tolerated pretty far. But by the same token, it isn't taken very seriously. That isn't to say you'll never have a chance to influence policy. You might at some point, and that keeps you going. It says, I'll put up with this because the day may come when I'll make a real difference from within. But generally that turns out to be a delusion. It's just too easy. The policy has a lot of momentum from within. The interests that are pushing it are not very well challenged from inside the government. And the chances are that your dissenting opinion will just be filed, shunted away. If that happens, the next question should be, well, I've tried that. What should I do now? And that's what I did ask myself late in the game in 1969. I wish I'd asked that a lot earlier instead of staying inside. But the seductions of keeping your dissent internal are very strong, because self-interest in a career sense converges with the rather plausible belief that power is exerted by men in power. They're nearly all men. And that having access to them, direct access, being listened to, being able to give them a memo, to make a suggestion by them, is surely more powerful and more valuable than anything you could do outside the government. That is very plausible to a lot of Americans, inside and out, and it has some truth to it, but it's greatly exaggerated. People, because of that self-interest factor, will be held in, trying to change the policy from within and always failing, when by going outside channels and organizing resistance and educating conflicting powers in the legislature or in the courts or in the press, in the public, grassroots, they could actually have a far more powerful effect, though that would probably be at the cost of their careers.
Howard talks about we have kind of the futility of voting, saying, well, to vote for every couple seconds it takes to vote. And we have two parties in the United States. We have the Republicans and we have the Democrats. But he also, in the same sentence, and then it becomes clear that but it's really citizens who change things.
I might say, if I differ at all, as a little matter of emphasis, from Dave Dellinger, let's say, from whom I've learned a lot and from whom I have unbounded respect, as for Howard. And I could also say Noam Chomsky. These are three people that I've learned tremendously from and have great admiration and love for. I do think they underrate a little the need for at least individuals and groups to change and to speak out from within the system and the government, if I have to say, as I did. In other words, I think that the change that the grassroots people and that these very same people had on me was not insignificant, that it would be good to have that effect on others within the system. I'm speaking then about the possibility that officials will hear the message and will actually change. I think more focused effort could well be used to try to get more of that, to have more people from within tell what they know, release the documents that they know. Do the same sort of thing I did, essentially, which would also include testifying to Congress with documents. Another point is the importance of elections and of lobbying. And I think a lot of the people who focus on the civil disobedience and the grassroots work and the demonstrations underrate a little the importance of using that very energy to change congressional action in a kind of focused way, and that means lobbying in part. Even letter writing, which is easy to brush off or despise as meaningless, I think is more meaningful than people realize. But definitely lobbying and elections. I have heard, let's say Dave Dellinger, for instance, just dismiss the significance of electoral work. I think that's wrong. I think you need it all. You need it all. The lobbying, the electoral work, the campaign work, the direct face-to-face confrontation with officials, and the grassroots, the civil disobedience, the demonstrations, the nonviolence. In Vietnam, I think every aspect of that was needed, or the war would have gone on longer than it did. And it's the synergy that's very important. They work together. To emphasize just one of those to the exclusion of the others would, I think, be wrong.
When do you meet Howard?
I actually think I first met him at a meeting at Faneuil Hall in Boston, where we were proposing a people's indictment of the FBI to counteract the trial of Iqbal Ahmad, Phil Berrigan, Liz McAllister, of others on the charges of having conspired to kidnap Kissinger. And that was one of the first public meetings I probably participated in. I'd been in one or two a few teach-ins before that, but not much. I had copied the Pentagon Papers almost 2 years earlier, but they hadn't come out yet. And so I spoke at that, and then we went over to the FBI office and presented our people's indictment of the FBI, and that led to great consternation and chaos in the FBI office. It was in an upper story in a big Boston office building, federal building. And I forget who announced that we were there to indict the FBI, but I'll never forget FBI agents jumping over desks, pulling their guns from their shoulder holsters, their shirts, and the secretaries were screaming, "Agents to the fore! Agents to the fore!" Probably a cry that had not been heard in that office previously. They were very excited. No one had tried to indict them before, it seemed, I guess.
Well,
a reasonable assumption. And that was my meeting with Howard.
Wow. We did, I'll tell you that later, but we did a documentary about the FBI. After knowing what I know about the FBI, I'm kind of, wow, that took some guts to do. Did you think? You knew what the FBI, you guys knew you and Howard and Ed, what the FBI was.
No, we hadn't dealt directly. I mean, the FBI had dealt with us, I guess. They had been following us about, but we hadn't been made too aware of it. I don't know how much dealing he'd had directly with them. It was just, in effect, an impudent gesture, which was to try to turn around the questions about legitimacy and who is really obeying the law and who is not in this case, and to raise legal questions about the war, which is, of course, something Howard had done. Now, I had known of Howard. I'd read his work before, because he did something that actually was almost unique in the war. And of extreme importance, though I can't say that it had an immediate effect. And that was that he wrote a little book on giving the case for getting out, the case for withdrawal. The idea of simply pulling up stakes, cutting losses, getting out, leaving the effort, which was what should have been done, essentially, or was the only way out. The only way out of Vietnam was for the United States was an acceptance of defeat of our stated and private purposes there. They were not going to be achieved ever. They never were, and only by recognition of that could the war be ended. But no executive official, no president ever came to the point where he was ready to be the man who presided over a defeat, over a failure. In what we've just gone through, I don't know if I should refer to this or not, but because it may date our interview here, but the headline today is Clinton proclaims victory in Kosovo. Well, had Slobodan Milosevic not been willing to accept what amounted to a defeat, essentially, which he's calling victory, by the way, at home, but not everyone believes him. And it is a defeat, essentially. Had he not been willing to accept that defeat, this war could have gone on indefinitely long. I mean, men in power are willing to see almost any number of their own people and other people die, rather than to admit a failure or an error or a defeat. And I think that would have been true for Clinton too. If Milosevic had been more tenacious, more obstinate, as he might well have been, I mean, we were gambling on that. I think Clinton would not have cut the losses in this and would have been willing to bomb and bomb and bomb, and ultimately to go to a ground war like Vietnam that would have been disastrous for both sides. In effect, Howard was in the position then in Vietnam of saying to one side, lose it. He didn't suggest that it had to be put in those most humiliating and bald terms, but that we had to grasp basically that we were not going to achieve our objectives, and we had to redefine those objectives. And if you like, act like Milosevic and say, as Senator Aiken once proposed, let's say we've won and get out. And that's basically what Milosevic is doing today. He's saying he won and his troops are leaving Kosovo. And that's what should have happened in Vietnam. Now, what I'm saying is not only were presidents not willing to say that, but their advisors were not willing even to suggest it in top secret memos to the president. 2 years into the big war, Robert McNamara basically said that to the president in a top secret memo on May 19th, 1967. The president had the memo read by all the other advisors. They all denounced it totally as close to, it was appeasement, close to treason. I came very close to that word. Defeatist, certainly, weakness. Unacceptable, totally unacceptable. Well, of course, the president had no intention of following it. More seriously, McNamara himself was fired within months after he'd essentially gone one step further and said, not only should we lower our objectives in Vietnam to a level that amounted to defeat, but we should stop the bombing immediately. He said that on November 1st, 1967, and was fired upwards to the World Bank within weeks of doing that. So he did lose his job, in effect. What he did not do was tell the Congress what he had told the president. Now, he should have done that. I didn't do that at that time, so I can't point a finger at him in 1967. Nor did I do it in 64 or 65, when I could have done the same, as could he. Either of us, or any one of hundreds of people in the government, could have given the Congress documents in 1964 or 1965 that would have prevented the war. And we didn't do that. I didn't think of it, and I doubt if any of the others thought of doing such a thing. Of course, I did think of it by 69, 4 years later. But going back to 67 then, McNamara simply could have published his memo, which would have read remarkably similar to that of Howard Zinn. See, same arguments, same reasons, basically, same pitch. And of course, coming from Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, it would have had a good deal more attention and weight than for the historian Howard Zinn to be saying this. But even so, Howard was doing what he could to change the terms of discussion. Had even one or two people been willing to join him on the same level or with more authority, at that time, it could have had a tremendous effect. As it was, I think his book was called The Logic of Withdrawal. Almost no one was willing to join outside the government in suggesting that this was an acceptable course for the United States. Any more, probably a little less than we just saw in Serbia, which is supposed to be a dictatorship. I think there was a little more discussion there during the war by people, Vuk Draskovic and others, who were willing to say, this is hopeless, it's useless, let's end it. They weren't willing to say that in the United States, and Howard stuck his neck out and did do it. And if only more people had followed that, I'm saying it could have been very important. As it was, I think it didn't get a great deal of attention, but I noticed that it got my attention.
I view May of 1971. I view May of 1971 in retrospect as like a accumulation of the anti-war movement and a real victory.
You said May of 71?
May of 71.
May
You release...
Well, I released that was in June of 71.
June. You're just getting ready to release.
Now, in May, when you mentioned May, I had very close touch with Howard, it so happens.
Okay, let's talk
because we were in an affinity group on an action organized by Rennie Davis and others in Washington called May Day demonstration, which was the idea of which was to close Washington down. If they won't stop the war, we'll stop the government. And a bunch of us, Howard and I, Noam Chomsky, Marilyn Young, Mark Patashny, Fred Branchman, Mitchell Goodman. Some others were in a small affinity group that was sat together on the streets of Washington to stop the traffic. Again, symbolically, to say no business as usual. If you're going to carry on the war, you must do it over our bodies. The same logic as when people sat in draft board doorways. Couldn't actually stop the war, but we could say it is not being done with our consent. We're making that as clear as we can. We're putting our bodies in the way of the war. And that was an interesting day in Washington with Howard. I could go into that. But a day later, 2 days later, the two of us were actually sitting in front of the Federal Building, side by side, in Boston. Again, the same day, a blockade of the Federal Building, surrounding it, supposedly keeping business as usual from happening. In fact, on that day, a bunch of people who were inside, Federal Employees for Peace, came out and paraded around holding up their ID cards to show they were federal employees on our side, opposing the war. Now, the day before that, in Boston Common, I heard Howard give one of his most eloquent speeches to a vast crowd in Boston Common. And Howard is, I think, could be the best public speaker I've ever heard. He's certainly one of the best, and one of the funniest, actually. A very, very funny man, personally, and before a crowd. And then, of course, he can switch or evolve into the passion and commitment that communicates itself very wonderfully. So he's a wonderful speaker. On this occasion, I remember a couple of things he said. That was in 1971, that was 28 years ago. He said, he talked about our action just 2 days earlier in Washington. And he said if that day had ended after we'd been maced and tear gassed and beaten and various things, but almost nobody we had seen had been arrested because the police were just clearing the streets. At that time, they weren't arresting people. But that afternoon, they proceeded to arrest 13,000 people simply by sweeping down the streets of Georgetown, largely taking anybody who looked like a student, anybody with a beard, with long hair, including tourists and children of congressmen who happened to be there. And most of the people of the 13,000 arrested, had probably not taken much part in the actions that morning. So in Boston, Howard said, if Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had been walking the streets of Georgetown 2 days ago, they would have been arrested for being young. And he said at the end of his speech, I remember, he said, now let me address the secret police in this crowd, the undercover policemen. He said, you were acting the role of secret police. You were doing something that should not be done in America. You should reconsider what you were doing, and you should change it. Well, that cost him a bit, I think, the next day when we were sitting in front of the Federal Building, I have a feeling. Because, again, the police chose in the end to arrest almost no one. They didn't want arrest, they didn't want a trial, they didn't want the publicity to be associated with that. They only arrested a couple of ringleaders, and one of those was Howard. He was pulled away, beaten heavily. His shirt was ripped off him. There was blood on his chest from his forehead after he'd just been sitting next to me. And I had a distinct feeling that his comments to the police in the crowd a couple of days earlier had been not gone down well, let's say, and that they had it in for him. But another incident from that day was very striking to me, about symbolic of the way wars go and the way they go on. While we were sitting in front of the police, a number of the police had come up to us to pay their respects to Howard, because it turned out he had lectured to the police academy in Boston on civil liberties or something. And they liked his lecture. So several of them came, "Oh, you're Professor Zinn. It's such, I really enjoyed your lecture, and it's an honor to meet you, and, it's wonderful." And here we were sitting there, and so forth, and the police were paying their respects to him in a very nice way. And the police had been quite friendly to us in a pleasant way, official way, while we were sitting there most of the morning. Then at a certain moment, they got their order to clear us out, basically. And they straightened up their belts, and they put their plastic masks in front of their heads. And they were carrying 4-foot clubs, batons, which it turned out later had been banned. They were illegal. They were an excessive force. Very large, like baseball bat. And so they began slapping these ominously, against their hands, and make a noise, and getting them forward. So they were all dressed up, as they say in the military, lined up in front of us, and began to edge forward to move us away. Well, we sort of looked at each other and we thought, well, we didn't come here to just get up and walk away when the police moved forward. We were here to get arrested, if necessary, That's what we meant by putting our bodies there. And so let them arrest us, And we didn't know that they evidently had orders not to arrest. So the police began moving forward, and a man in front of us, I heard it whispering over our heads as we were sitting there, who had just minutes before been extremely friendly, not having discussion, but pleasant, started to whisper, "Move, move, get out, quick, right away, move." And as I said, that was the point when we sort of looked at each other and decided, well, no, let's let them arrest us. We're not just going to move. The feet came forward. They were edging under our feet, essentially, just shuffling forward. And then the guy got very urgent, the whispering, and he said, "For God's sake, move." And we didn't. And at that point, the batons were raised, and they began clubbing us very heavily on our shoulders. There had been a little discussion of whether it was nonviolent to put your hands over your head, or did that suggest fear, and was there something violent? There was a theory that was violent. I did not accept that theory, fortunately. So I had my hands on my head, and I had a Rolex watch at that point, which was smashed by this baton. And then the glass got into my wrist, and there was blood flowing down my arms. The Rolex continued to run, by the way. Rather impressive. There was a series of ads at that time of Rolexes being, found in sharks' bellies, and so forth, and still running. And I thought maybe I could do an ad of this, this Rolex was hit by a 212-pound Boston policeman with a 4-foot baton, and still keeping perfect time, but without the crystal. So I was, being beaten. And Howard, meanwhile, was not beaten. He was beaten, but he was pulled up, as I say. His shirt was ripped apart. He was taken away, and I saw blood coming down his chest as he left. And as a matter of fact, after that, I went and got bandaged. There was a first aid station in our group. Got bandages around my wrists, and came back. And sat with Zinn and their housemate, Hilda. And so we sat there for a while, and I was thinking how, for the first time, how it must have felt for the Vietnamese in operations that were called county fairs that the Marines had done, where the Marines would, and others, would gather all the people in a village in order to run them through interrogation. The idea was that if you interrogated everyone, they would realize that if they told who the Viet Cong were, they informed on the things that they collaborated, no one would know which one had done it. so that they were safer in revealing this. It didn't work particularly well, but that was the idea of it. So while they were interrogating each person in a village, mostly women and children and old people, they would be giving inoculations to the children and giving them candy and doing this. And the American military doing this felt very virtuous about it. They called it a county fair operation. But of course, here are these large, heavily uniformed and heavily armed men confronting totally unarmed people. And here we were sitting on the ground with these heavily armed policemen, quite large, with their batons and their weapons and their helmets. And I felt how naked one feels without a weapon, being confronted by armed men with guns. As John Sayles just said, quite a good movie with that title about Central America, Men with Guns. And it's what, of course, the people of Kosovo have been afflicted by for quite a while, one way or another. And that history is not over for them. So, as I say, we felt naked. And not that guns in our hands would have improved the situation at all. But it makes you feel different. But then we saw the police begin to form up again to charge us we had retreated a little bit. So in our new line, they were going to come at us again. Well, Howard Zinn and Hilda were a decade older than I was at that point, so I thought I got in front of them so as to take the first blows myself. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and Hilda was saying, "Excuse me," that I was sitting there. And as she later told me, I didn't come out here to have you protect me, to be protected by a man. So excuse me, and I got back behind them, So. And on this occasion, the police didn't charge us in the end, didn't come at us. So in the end, we left. Well, all that was just a couple of weeks before the Pentagon Papers were released. And just to carry it up to that story, I got the word on Saturday inadvertently from someone, on Saturday the 12th of June, from someone in the Times that the Times building was totally locked down. They were expecting a raid from the FBI, and they were about to put out the Pentagon Papers. The person calling me didn't know I had given the Pentagon Papers to the Times, so it was just by chance that I happened to get this call. And that revealed to me that Neil Sheehan and the Times had not warned me that they were about to put them out. It so happened I'd given them to Neil Sheehan and the New York Times several months earlier, but he hadn't told me when or if they were coming out. Well, that meant the FBI might be coming at me any minute. And it so happened that I had a copy of the papers in my house for the first time in months. I had always kept them away from my apartment so the FBI wouldn't get them. But at that moment, I had them in because I was planning to give them to Senator Gravel 2 days later to use in a filibuster against the draft, which he had proposed to do. I told him I was going to give him enough material to read forever, essentially, if he wanted to do it. And 7,000 pages. So I had them in my apartment, and thus the FBI might come any moment. I called Howard, with whom we were supposed to go to the movies that night. We were going to go to see Butch Cassidy at the Harvard Square movie house that night. So I asked him, I don't know if I said it over the phone or waited until he arrived, but that I had this problem, and would he store the Pentagon Papers for me? It was the first, I'm not sure I had told him at all before what I was doing about this. And he said yes, of course, right away. And so I think we went over to his apartment right away first and stored the papers in his apartment. Then we came back to our apartment, which was near Harvard Square. And I don't know if I should reveal this or not, but you can edit it, I think, at this stage. Someone had also unusually given me some grass, and again, I didn't want that fun. So we smoked what we could, and we flushed the rest down the toilet before the movie, and then we went off to see Butch Cassidy. And that night, the night of the 12th, 13th, we picked up the early morning edition, the Sunday edition of the New York Times with the Pentagon Papers.
So you were never sure that Neil Sheehan was going to release it?
No, I wasn't sure at all. That's why I was giving it to Gravel. He hadn't told me.
Yeah. Did you like the movie?
Oh, we loved the movie, and it was the second time I'd seen it. I remember there used to be an ice cream parlor named Brigham's next to the movie house, and we bought an ice cream cone covered with chocolate sprinkles, I recall, and we were walking down the street passing this ice cream cone between us. Now, this is the only time I remember getting stoned with Howard, actually, but we were still very stoned from this grass that we had to dispose of. And so we were passing the ice cream cone. I remember saying, in this square, Harvard Square, if anybody sees us, what we're doing, passing this ice cream, they'll know our state of consciousness.
That's one of the things that everyone tells me about Howard, and I've gotten to know him, his ability to make just a terrific sense of humor. And, we asked Cleveland Sellers about that. Was he always this funny in the light of, there's some really serious things going on here, and his ability to maintain it.
Well, Howard is very funny. Has a wonderful sense of timing. He's a good stand-up comedian.
Yeah, it kind of relieves all that stuff in those days. Relieved the tension, didn't it? Mm-hmm. Just that little. So when the Pentagon Papers get released, tell me a little bit about the trial that of Howard's testimony.
Well, yes, there were just 2 times in that I was in court for 5 months, and there were 2 times when I cried that I recall. Once was during a lunch break. I had just been testifying about a scene. I forget what brought it up, but a scene that I'd seen in Long An province, south of Saigon, where the Viet Cong had been had raided into a village which was right near a militia. The militia we were paying, essentially, the South Vietnamese militia, regional forces, had a base right next to this village. And when the Viet Cong came in, the regional forces had simply fired into the village and burned it to the ground, essentially. It was basically their own village. And I'd come on the scene while everything was still smoking the next day. Children's dolls, bits of crockery. People had very few possessions to start with, and what they had, were all blackened and smoking at this point from mortar fire from the regional forces. And it was basically what we've just done to Kosovo, essentially. You get fired at it's what we did in Vietnam all the time, get fired at from a village, and we lay waste to the village. And so delivering that scene, there was then a break for lunch, and I just started crying enormously because I could see it again. And the anguish of the whole Vietnam experience. People saw that I was crying, but I think no one knew why I was crying or what had evoked it. They didn't know what was in my mind, the scenes that were in my mind. But the other time was when Howard testified. He actually testified about how we could have taken a different...
Stop a second.
It doesn't matter. It's the most terrible thought, but it's the one that Howard is always raising. That things could have been different. Things could have been different if we'd followed our own ideals, our declared ideals. He talked about the Atlantic Charter, self-determination, the ideals for which Clinton has just laid waste to Serbia and Kosovo, basically, from the air. But he talked about the Atlantic Charter. Now, the Atlantic Charter was, I guess, in 1943, I think, between Truman, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And I knew that because I was 12 years old at that time. He was 22. And what it meant, the 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms. And if we'd acted on the idea of self-determination, we would never have started a colonial war with the French. And that thought of ideals abused and ignored and gone wrong. It was very anguishing to me as an American. So I remember crying during his testimony. It's funny, I was just seeing our friend Ron Kovic, who was a Marine in Vietnam, of course became a paraplegic in an action there, born on the 4th of July. He was just in town to protest our bombing of Serbia, or try to end it. And we were having dinner with him. And this was just 2 weeks ago. So as we came out on Pennsylvania Avenue, went to my car there with my wife Patricia, and we looked up the street, and there was the Capitol all lit up, looking very elegant, beautiful. And Patricia said, "This really is a beautiful city. If only it stood for what it stands for." And that was what Howard's testimony was. If only we stood for what we stand for. What we claim to stand for. What?
Did you look at the jury at that time? Could you?
What?
Did Could you tell what the jury's reaction was at that time when Howard was speaking?
I don't know, really. I imagine it was probably new to them. History tends to be new to Americans. They don't hear a lot of it. I doubt if many of them were old enough to remember the Atlantic Charter. They were younger than I was on the whole. Not all of them. Some of them would. But, as...
I asked that question because Howard talks about in the times that he testified.
Yeah, let me...
Yeah. Several times I've read in his books about juries that are then, when given, and he uses the Pentagon Papers, he uses the thing up in with David Dellinger in Vermont, in Winooski. Is that right next door to Winooski? Yeah, Winooski 44, who sat in on one of the senator's offices and he's protesting the Nicaragua thing. And that when juries confronted with the facts, with not just the facts, with the truth, something that they haven't heard before, set out uninterrupted with the newscasters or anything like that, and it's in a judgment. Judges, they invariably, and this relates to your trial, because you were found innocent by the jury, right?
No,
I'm sorry.
No, as I said, the charges were dismissed when it came out. When it came out of the crimes that Nixon had done against me, the judge dismissed the charges just before it went to the jury, so it didn't go to the jury.
Okay. But the people will, in many cases, it used to be, Vietnam is an example. It says, juries will find if you're allowed to present moral arguments. That's what I'm really getting at. When you're
if I may say, there's a little confusion there. Will acquit people. Let me say, from one point of view, that's almost never happens. What you just said is, I would disagree with. What can be said, what is true, is there is a valid defense called the defense of necessity, or lesser evil, choice of evils, a justification defense. There are different names for it in different states and different jurisdictions. But the idea is that it can be legal to do something that would otherwise be a violation of law if it's necessary to do that to prevent an imminently greater evil. Now, if a judge allows that defense to be raised and therefore allows testimony to come out on the greater evil, the nature of the greater evil, and the lack of alternative ways of confronting it, given a justification defense like that, a jury will most usually acquit, and that's why judges and prosecutors bar the defense from being raised at all. If juries are allowed to believe, in other words, that they can, without breaking any law, acquit someone who has really acted to rightly, has done the right thing to prevent some greater evil, they will acquit. But usually the judge won't allow that argument to be made. He should, but they don't, because it will lead to an acquittal. Without that defense, if it's just on the straight facts of whether a given law was violated or not, I would have to say that no matter how impressed the juries are by the intentions and the character of the defendants and the moral arguments that they're making, they will convict. They will often cry as they do it, which is less impressive to the defendants than it might be to feel that I've touched their hearts and they hate doing what they're doing, but they are going to send me to jail anyway, even though I've done the right thing. I can say as a defendant, I have mixed feelings when I see that happen, because I think, don't they realize that they could have hung this jury, if they wanted, or they could have found for an acquittal. You have to give them the sense that they can do that without somehow violating the law themselves. So I'm sure Howard has been on both sides of that situation.
In fact, that was I couldn't remember what the defense was.
Yeah.
The defense.
No. If they're allowed to hear a justification defense, and you have a valid case, which is usually the case in these civil disobedience, they will typically, you very often get an acquittal, but that's a rare class of cases.
And the judges do anything to keep that from coming out?
No, if the judge, basically, you see, the judge has the right to do that, to allow that defense to be made. And when a judge does that, you understand usually that they are on your side, that the judge is using his powers or her powers to allow you to present this evidence in a way that will probably lead to an acquittal. And that's their way of joining your action, in a way. And if what you're doing is opposing an unjust war or trying to stop an arms race, it's what the judges should do if they did understand the real situation, if they rose to the occasion. I do feel that it's worth getting people in authority, challenging them to rise to the circumstances and give and to understand what their real options are and what their real freedom is. But that's Howard's whole life, intellectually and politically, is to give people a sense of their choices and their freedom and their power if they are willing to act freely, and to act at a risk if necessary. Actually, there's different ways to tell history, and probably the commonest is simply to tell the story, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. But there always is some implicit sense of why it's happening that informs the historian and usually gets through to the reader. And there's a sense of causation, but again, that is often presented as if it were inevitable. This happened because that happened. It had to happen this way. There was no choice. The reader is very often given the message, at least subliminally, that things were inevitable, which is to say the people at the time had no real ability to change the events. And if you're learning lessons from that, the lesson is you don't have that power either. Sit back, let it happen. You don't have any ability to affect events. And of course, Howard tells things from an entirely different point of view, that people at the time had choices, and including people who didn't, on the surface, have a great deal of authority and power, acting together, and that might be inspired by an individual acting individually, but acting ultimately together in an organized way. Even people who don't have much money or much status or much expertise or power can raise issues, can influence events, can change the course of history. They could have done it in the past, and his message is they can do it now and they can do it in the future. And that's a message both of hope and of reality. I personally, I try to give a similar message, and I don't do it just to inspire people in ways that I think are misleading. I tell them the odds are against them very often. The odds are against them. It's an uphill fight. The chance of succeeding is not large, in fact, but it does exist. And the existence of that possibility of changing matters by changing your own life is a reality. It's a truth. It's as true as anything else. And when people understand that, they don't have to be given assurance, a guarantee, success when the stakes are very great. They will take large risks in their own lives when they realize that there's a chance of actually making a difference. And Howard, more than anyone else I can think of, has communicated to a large fraction of the Earth's population that there is that chance, and that by changing our own lives, we can change history.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.